Our keynote speaker today is Dr. David Hirsh. David is a senior lecturer in sociology at Goldsmiths University of London. He wrote his PhD at Gurevich University on crimes against humanity international law, and his first book, Law Against Genocide, Cosmopolitan Trial, won the Philip Abrams Prize for the best book. His new book, out in August 2017, is Contemporary Left Anti-Semitism, and you can purchase it after it if you wish. It combines narrative and case study with sociological analysis and theory to understand the controversial and contested phenomena of anti-Semitism on the left. It is not a critic of the left, but a contemporary history of how things may go wrong. And with this note, David, the floor is yours.
Thank you very, very much, David. I know that you say, oh yeah, I'll organise an event, and I know it's much more work than you imagine it's going to be. So I want to thank David very, very much for organising. I just want to say a few words about my book. The book really is a story, I think, of the mainstreaming of anti-Semitism. My own story begins really when I was a student in the student movement in the 1980s, and even then, following the 1970s, the Zionism equals racism stuff that came out of the UN, and before that out of the Soviet Union, people in the 1980s in the student movement were saying we need to prohibit, we need to ban Jewish societies in universities. And they were doing that because they said very straightforwardly, Jewish societies are Zionist and Zionism is racism, and we shouldn't tolerate racism on our campuses, so we have to prohibit Jewish societies. This was a first lesson really in how this kind of, apparently sophisticated logical progression works against Jews. So it wasn't, Zionist societies. This was Jewish societies on campus, and people were trying to prohibit them, and we were involved in those fights. But I think the key thing, looking back now, is that those fights were really marginal. They were in a little strange corner of the left where I used to, enjoy hanging out, and it was a fight with other people on that little strange corner of the left. Nobody in the mainstream of the student movement took it seriously. Nobody in the mainstream of the Labour Party took it seriously. And that politics was confined to a kind of fringe. The story of the book is how that politics and those ideas moved more and more into the mainstream. It begins with a chapter on Ken Livingstone. People might know who Ken Livingstone is. He was the mayor of, he's kind of the natural mayor of London to many people. He was in charge of the leader. He was the leader of the Greater London Council. Margaret Thatcher abolished him because she didn't like him, and he came back later as the mayor of London. He's a very kind of mainstream and kind of liked figure on the left. And Ken Livingstone has been involved for many decades in this kind of anti-Zionist politics, in particular in the attempt to make people believe, to educate people to believe that Zionism and Nazism are similar, in the sense that they both agree that Jews shouldn't live in Europe and that they must live separately outside of Europe. And not only are they similar, but they collaborate with each other. The Zionists collaborated with the Nazis in creating the Holocaust so that they could create the State of Israel, and the Nazis supported Zionism. Indeed. It's a real pleasure, actually, to be able to start the book with a chapter about Ken Livingstone, because I named a particular formulation after Ken Livingstone. To cut a very long story short, Livingstone got involved in a rather stupid, drunken argument. I think it was drunken. He denies it, but it was after a party. He got involved in an argument with a reporter outside the party. Actually, the reporter who had been promised a quote after the party. And so the reporter goes to Livingstone and says, "Can I have a quote? How was the party? Tell me." And Livingstone, for whatever reason, said, go away, I'm not interested, don't want to talk to you. And the reporter says, come on, just give me a quote. I just need a quote for the paper, we can go home. And Livingstone says, no, whatever. And the guy says, come on, I'm just a reporter, I'm doing my job. And Livingstone attaches to this little phrase, I'm just doing my job, and he says, you're just like a German concentration camp guard. You know, I mean, it's not a big deal, it's just this kind of trivial foolishness, really. And the guy says, look, I'm Jewish, you know, don't talk to me like that, just give me a quote, we all go home. And so Livingstone went home. He must have woken up the next morning with a little bit of a hangover, I think, and he must have said to himself, oh, what have I done? You know, I've been caught on tape saying to a Jewish concentration camp guard kind of relentlessly, sorry, that was a Freudian slip, wasn't it? Saying to the Jewish reporter, you're like a Jewish, I'm too busy. The point is that Livingstone didn't see this as a gap. He didn't see this as something he needed to apologise for. He saw it as a political opportunity. He saw being accused of anti-Semitism as an opportunity to show that he was radical and to show that he stands up to the power that controls the discourse and which oppresses the Palestinians. And he said, for far too long, people who criticise the Israeli government, like I do, have been accused of anti-Semitism. And I looked at this response and I said, I recognise this. I've seen this before, I've seen this many times before. And somebody raises the issue of anti-Semitism and says, I think there's a problem. I think there's a problem with BDS or with boycotts or with being rude to a Jewish journalist. And the response isn't to say, oh, well, maybe there's an issue here. The response is absolute denial and counter-accusation of Jewish bad faith. So it sets up a presumption that when somebody raises the issue of anti-Semitism, it sets up a presumption that they're speaking in bad faith in an attempt to silence criticism of Israel and to silence people who worry about the human rights abuses that are perpetrated against the Palestinians or that are, you know, both real and imagined. So this presumption of bad faith. I raise the issue of anti-Semitism, somebody says, how dare you accuse me, because I know what you're doing. What you're doing is trying to silence me. The name of the current anti-Zionist organisation, I think it's mainly a Jewish anti-Zionist organisation, which is fighting to say that there's no anti-Semitism at all in the British Labour Party. The name of it is Free Speech on Israel. They're standing up for the ability to criticise Israel without being accused in a kind of disgustingly, dastardly way of anti-Semitism. Now, for people with experience of trying to stand up against anti-Semitism and trying to have these discussions, either politically or in academia, you'll recognise this. That you try and raise an issue, you try and present evidence, you try to say, this is, you know, I'm worried about this, I'm worried about that. And the response is to say, you're lying. And you know you're lying, and you're doing so as part of the Israel lobby or part of a Zionist or Jewish conspiracy to defend Israel. And it's very, very corrosive because what it does is it makes it almost impossible, or it's an attempt to make it impossible to have a rational discussion about anti-Semitism. Instead, what it does is it defines people who raise the issue of anti-Semitism as being outside of the community of the people who we discuss rationally with. So it was a pleasure to begin with Ken Livingstone, partly because actually the Livingstone formulation and that mode of presuming bad faith runs throughout the book. And one of the problems we have when we're writing academic stuff is that we always have to go back and explain from the beginning, because everybody says, well, hang on, what about this, what about that? It's all there in the first chapter. A description of the Livingstone formulation and how it operates. Livingstone is rather obsessive about Nazis, actually. Livingstone from the 80s was publishing cartoons of Menachem Begin. We are in his museum, yes. doing a straight-arm salute and wearing an SS uniform. And Livingstone has been pushing this line for a long time and is still pushing it. This is a live issue just last week and the week before. The issue of whether it's in any sense reasonable or okay to say that Zionists are like Nazis or to say that the Nazis supported the Zionists. This was going around Labour Party conference this autumn, and if people want to know more about what's been happening in the last week with Moshe Machover, then please ask me. The book goes on to look at the mainstreaming, the recent stuff, the mainstreaming of various kinds of anti-Semitism in the student movement and in the labour movement, which have really come with or culminated in Jeremy Corbyn and him becoming leader of the Labour Party. Jeremy Corbyn is a really interesting example. He believes himself to be a staunch opponent of anti-Semitism. I think he honestly believes himself to be a staunch opponent of anti-Semitism, but he keeps on doing things which seem to belie that. So, for example, everybody knows, I think, probably everyone in this room knows, that he is quoted as having referred to Hamas and Hezbollah as friends. Now, when that was put to him, he came up with a kind of vaguely plausible story. He said, look, we were having a discussion, I'm for the peace process, I'm for talking to everybody in the conflict, they were in the room, I was being polite. It was diplomatic language. What do you want me to call them? Right? It's kind of plausible. But if you go further on into the quote, you'll find that what he actually says is that he says that Hamas and Hezbollah are dedicated to the good of the Palestinian people, and he says that they're dedicated to peace and justice in the Middle East, political justice and social justice. Kind of astonishing. How is this possible? I think it's possible if you look at the worldview. The worldview represented in politics by Jeremy Corbyn and represented by many people in intellectual life is a worldview which splits the world kind of into two. And the watchword of this worldview is keep your eye on the ball, right? The real cruel and oppressive apparatus in the world isn't Hamas or Hezbollah. The real cruel and oppressive apparatus is whatever you want to call it, capitalism or imperialism or modernity. That's the problem. That's what makes people poor, that's what allows war, that's what allows famine, that's what alienates people from their own labour, that's this machine throughout the globe of ideology and power which oppresses people. And if that's your worldview, then anybody who rises up or speaks against or fights against the central edifice of power across the globe is kind of in some sense on our side. Now it's a problematic worldview because it's a real break from any kind of traditional or serious left-wing position. When I teach Marx to our first-year sociology students, the first thing I say to them is, Marx loved capitalism. And they all go, huh? Marx loved capitalism. Why did Marx love capitalism? Because he thought that it created human rights and law and politics and democracy and the productive forces to make a new world possible, and cities which enabled people to interact, and trade unions which enabled people to stick together and to make solidarity. And it put on the agenda the possibility of a better world. And in Marx, his view of capitalism is kind of is dialectical, right? It's very, very exciting and dynamic and progressive. It's also alienating and enslaving. And if you look at the political economists, all of the serious political economists and philosophers of modernity have always said this. Modernity is both a huge, dynamic, beautiful opportunity to make things better, and it's also got its really scary downside. If you compare that to the sort of Corbyn worldview, which comes out of the Communist Party, which says imperialism, capitalism, modernity is bad, and anyone who's against it is good. You'll find that this is a real break from a kind of traditional democratic revolt against oppression. So, the second chapter is about the rise of Jeremy Corbyn and his politics. In particular, the ways in which a rational debate about anti-Semitism and actually about much else is avoided with allegations of just bad faith. So the kind of boundaries of the community of people who are okay are policed not with rational debate, but by kind of coercive means, like the Livingstone formulation. The third chapter is about the rise of examples of anti-Semitism which came to light in the Labour Party for two reasons. One is that the anti-Zionists were moving into the Labour Party in 2016, and the other is that it became a mainstream issue because the leader of the Labour Party was now politically related to it. And there were lots of examples. Somebody said, we need to reopen the Jewish question. You know, a kind of Marxist who now had Labour Party membership. Somebody else said in the Oxford University Labour Club, Jewish students were being baited with songs, bombs over Tel Aviv. Lots and lots of examples which I go through in the book. Corbyn was worried. He called the inquiry. He asked Chakrabarti to chair it, and kind of actually quite successfully made the issue go away. The book goes on to, in fact, it goes on to go backwards, and it says, where did this come from? And there's some people in this room who remember very well the fight within the University and College Union back in 2004, 2005 against the politics of boycott. And they remember the kind of everyday ways in which the politics of boycott brought with it into the union a kind of anti-Semitic sensibility and anti-Semitic culture. For example, one example that came to mind was somebody raised an issue with a certain aspect of BDS, and somebody else says, well, it's all in the Talmud, isn't it? Huh? It's all in the Talmud, that the Talmud says that the Jews are superior and the Jews should stick with themselves, and that's why these people in our union are opposing BDS. So again, it's a way of putting people out the door. You don't belong here. You don't belong in the community of rational discussion. And the book goes on to look at the EUMC and the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism and the struggles over that. The definition comes out, really, I think it comes out of Durban. It comes out of a global conference which said the key form of racism on the planet is Zionism. And it was a response to that, and the chapter actually does a kind of a history of how the definition came into being and what we can expect from a definition of anti-Semitism. People kind of want an app for their iPhone so they can plug in an image or an idea and say, is this anti-Semitic or is it not? In fact, it's much more complicated than that. We cannot have a definition which does that for us because such a judgment requires a political judgment, and also because there's such a polarization. There's lots and lots of other stuff in the book, which I don't have time to talk about right now, but I'm sure we'll have a discussion. I want to leave with one point, is that when I was just finishing the book, I went to the United States and spoke at a conference. Einat Wilf was there, and this was 2 weeks after the presidential election. And I just spent 15 years looking at the anatomy and the structures of left anti-Semitism. How it is represented by people who believe themselves to be opponents of anti-Semitism. How it's not explicit. How you need to make judgments, you need to interpret. How Jews stood up in order to bear witness against the Jewish community who had a problem. And I was in America at that moment, and suddenly these very same structures and shapes started appearing on the right. And I was kind of astonished to see it. But I wasn't only astonished, I thought, hang on, we know this. Anyone who's been on the left knows these shapes. So, for example, we had people in America defending Steve Bannon. Steve Bannon is one of the key organisers of the white nationalist movement, the alt-right. And he comes into the White House. Presumably he was behind the final day campaign video of the Trump campaign, which was very clearly a conspiracy theory video, which was, you know, a cigarette paper away from anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, but it didn't mention Jews. In my view, it was a dog whistle, and it was also something which keyed into that way of thinking. And just as when you say about Jeremy Corbyn, you have a problem with anti-Semitism, and everybody says, how dare you? How dare you? Jeremy's nice, Jeremy's our friend. So we started seeing the same thing. I think, if you said, I think there's a problem with Trump's campaign and with his final day campaign video in relation to anti-Semitism, people would say, but he never mentioned Jews. Or people would say, I'm a Jew, I'm an Orthodox Jew, and I can tell you that I give him a clean bill of health. Or people would say about Steve Bannon, some of his best friends are Jews, he's quite a safe guy to have at a bar mitzvah. And what it did was exactly what we've seen on the left for many, many years, which was to transform a notion of political anti-Semitism into a personal, individual, moral failing. And what we're looking at is really political, it's politics. It's not a kind of personal, moral failing, but it's something much more insidious than that, actually. So the book about left anti-Semitism started, for me, showing us something also about what was happening on the right, and I was worried about that. And what we see then is a kind of competitiveness, that people on the left suddenly become sophisticated in their ability to spot anti-Semitism on the right. You know, suddenly they look at Charlottesville and they say, look, the Nazis are marching, the Nazis are surrounding a synagogue in Charlottesville and singing, the Jews will not replace us, and they're bigger and they're stronger than they ever were. And even in the White House itself, we don't get a clear condemnation. And the left is suddenly looking at that and saying, hang on, there's an issue there. The right points at the left and says, there's an issue over there. Worry about the issue over there. And I think it's very easy for people to see anti-Semitism in a political community which is not their own. And it's easy for people to understand the anti-Semitism they see over there as a manifestation of the essential rottenness of the community over there. It's much harder to see it within your own political community. This book is about the anti-Semitism broadly within my own political community, and I think we need to stop that kind of competitiveness of always pointing, the real problem is over there, the real problem is over there. Thank you very much.